So before going to the graph-based dimensionality reduction techniques, we'll just set a brief introduction to graphs, because graphs are used now everywhere from now on, from dimensionality reduction to data integration to clustering and so forth. So this is a very brief introduction to it. So this is a plot, and this is a graph, and this is what from now on, when we mention about a graph, this is what we mean. So imagine that every dot is a sample, and they are connected to each other based on some similarity matrix, or it can be a gene, but usually we'll talk about them being a cell. And each line represents the connection between them, and each connection, for example here, can be a weighted proximity between those cells. So if the weight here is very dark, that means they are very well connected, or they are very near to each other. While the ones that are very thin, they will be less connected, or they are samples that are not that near apart. And then there are many different measures that you can use, so either correlation or using Euclidean distance. So basically, how to construct a graph is done by, for example, either you can assume a correlation, for example, between the samples. So here we have samples listed here, and then you have a correlation plot. Here is in a heat map, and you see the correlation between the different groups in here. Another way we can transform this correlation to adjacency, which is the inverse of the correlation, basically. So since they are highly correlation, they have higher correlation, the adjacency will indicate that they have lower proximity, so they are closer to each other, the samples from the same group. And then we can set a cutoff or find a graph from it. So the K and N is the K nearest neighbors. If we set the K to 5, we'll find the 5 nearest neighbors from that cell. So you go to this cell in here, and you find which one of those other cells are closest to me. And if you find the 5 closest ones will be the ones that have the lower value in here, or the higher value in this matrix. And then we can set them like this for all those cells. So for example, actually for this cell, this cell is actually closer to another cell in here, not this one. And this will be, for example, a weighted graph that you also consider not only the information which cells are closest to me, but I also know the value, how close they are to me. An unweighted graph, K and N also, you just define 1 or 0 if that cell is close to me or not close to me. And you see that the rest of the graph is blank. So this is all of those plots in here can be considered graphs, which is basically a representation of your data, how close those points are in your data. This adjacency and the correlation, since you have all values for all possible combinations in here, this is called a fully connected graph. While these ones are just graphs. And after that, you can also do visualization of your data in these terms of a network, for example, like representing the dots and the connections between them as the edges here. And we'll come to that more later on, but this is just an idea how that works for dimensionality reduction. So every graph-based dimensionality reduction technique can be divided in 2 major steps. The first one is to construct a weighted graph based on the top K connections, also defined as K and N. So it's basically this step. So either you have a correlation or some Euclidean distance, for example, and you want to find a weighted graph that reduces, you don't need all the connections here, but just the K and N. And then the second step is to create a low dimensionality layout of the graph, and then optimize it so that the layout is a representation of your data, which is basically how to create this graph here.